Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, the CMDB TMS in the Digital Age, a Bedrock for IT Transformation. My name is Raleigh Gould and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Our featured speakers are Dennis Drogseth, VP of Research at Enterprise Management Associates, and Bill Dyke, Product Manager at Micro Focus. Dennis brings over 30 years of experience in various aspects of marketing and business planning for service management solutions. He supports EMA through leadership in business service management, CMDB systems, automation systems, and service-centric financial optimization. Bill is responsible for product strategy and development of new discovery capabilities, methods, and tools, helping keep Micro Focus ahead of its competitors in CMS domain. Bill spent 27 years as part of IT before joining Micro Focus. And before I hand things over to today's featured speakers, I wanted the audience to know that Dennis and Bill will be dedicating the last few moments of today's presentation to answering your questions. Please feel free to log them anytime using the Q&A functionality. Also, today's event is being recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email from EMA today that will include the on-demand playback as well as some additional resources from Micro Focus, so I hope you will check that out. And now I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to our first featured speaker, Dennis Drogseth. Dennis?
Well, thank you, Raleigh. Delighted to talk with you today. The topic, as you can see, is looking at the CMDB TMS. We'll also talk a little bit more about what that really is. In the digital age, is it a bedrock for IT transformation? Our research and data shows that it is, probably more than ever. So briefly, what we'll be looking at are demographics in terms of some of the research we're leveraging, so you'll understand where the data is from. Then why go forward? What are the motives, reasons, likely outcomes? A snapshot of what's going on with deployments, not some of the trials and tribulations as well as some of the good things. We'll look at CMDB TMS and discovery and dependency mapping in 4 environments there: cloud, agile, SecOps, and financial optimization of IT. And we'll look at effective lessons learned in adopting CMDB and CMS and discovery and dependency mapping. This is an area of great interest to me and also unique fit with EMA in that we still have an active consulting practice, much of it actually going to supporting deployments on CMDB CMS environments. We do other things as well, but that has actually been one of our leads. So we continue to get new data about what's going on, what's right and what's wrong, as well as from research. Most of the data you'll see on the charts when you see hard numbers will be from research we did last year on future of IT service management. And you can see overall the highlights, mostly North America, but a significant population in Europe, good executive presence, a mix of verticals, and company size pretty balanced, starting at above 250 employees with a good chunk at 10,000 and above, including some 20,000 or more. But I have to confess that a lot of the data is coming from a variety of other research projects, including, as you'll see, work on financial optimization of IT, some unique work we did last year with our security analyst on integrating SecOps. And earlier for trending, you'll see I'll share some data on ITSM going back several more years, and then working from ITM, our own consulting work. And I'll take a second or a few seconds to plug a little book we did through the consulting practice. 3 of us pulled it together, and a lot of the book is devoted to real-world deployment conversations, what it takes to make things work. At the end, I'll share something of our methodology as a kind of wrap-up in terms of how to make CMDB effective. Okay, so why do it? What are the good reasons for it, and maybe some of the not so good reasons. So these are examples from consulting primarily, what people have said. And you'll see that we're going to share other reasons as well. This is not a complete list. But in a few conversations with a few deployments, decreasing time to resolve technical problems because it provides context, breaking down barriers between silos, which, by the way, some of the benefits of the deployment are also, in a sense, requirements to achieve an effective deployment. You really can't achieve an effective CMDB or CMS deployment without working on breaking down or breaking through some of the walls that separate siloed thinking in IT. Enabling automation, intelligently providing context for automation, facilitating enterprise dashboard, and there's a lot of value in reducing costs, understanding what's there, and we'll play all of these back in various forms. And below you'll see actual data from a few examples of what things were achieved. 70% reduction in mean time to repair, pretty good. And again, having context for understanding where and what things are ongoing. A rather user-friendly MSP who's actually been able to negotiate downward their costs because they understand better what they're spending for, so they get better customer loyalty. A healthcare organization, reducing downtime and actually reducing outages, which is a different story, by 40%. And they believe they achieved 300% return on investment just a few years. Also, from prior research, a similar list, but a little bit of different. Number one was right at the top at 58%, and yet it's also that reflective mirror that you don't do the CMDB effectively if you're not integrating data across multiple sources. So it became a context and a capability for doing that. Support for change management was at 46%. Support for IT governance and compliance at 39%. Once again here we see automation, a context so that we're not automating train wrecks but automating useful outcomes, and that was at 30%. Support for the last three pretty much just 1 or 2 percentage point difference. Support for inventory and asset management at 26%. The next, support for service at 25%, and ITIL at 23%. So ITIL is still around. That's another conversation. How wedded a CMDB and CMS is to ITIL best practices is another conversation. It's certainly a great departure point, is all I'll say for now. From the research I showed you in the beginning on the future of ITSM from last year, we always track success in a very simple way. We ask people to self-assign success, but then we compare extremes, and we get very useful outcomes. And you can see the relevance here. Those who were extremely successful in their ITSM-related initiatives, and that went far beyond just service desk. It included initiatives like SecOps and DevOps, integrated operations as well. We're twice as likely to own a CMDB than those who were just somewhat successful or unsuccessful. They were also much more aggressive in leveraging multiple use cases, a topic we'll talk about. 3 times more likely to federate, another topic we'll be revisiting. 7 times more likely to have plans to associate discovery and dependency mapping. That's a pretty high ratio there with the CMDB CMS. And those who were dramatically not successful or just somewhat successful were 8 times more likely not to have plans for discovery and dependency mapping. So you can see this is from a manager of asset and configuration technology for a large global manufacturer. the attributions actually in the next slide. The first sentence is what's really key. They were leveraging a lot of outsourcing. They wanted to take ownership more of what was going on in-house. And they needed to bring an effective CMDB and CMS together to make that work. This was a Micro Focus deployment, and so another part of it was leveraging a broader part of the Micro Focus portfolio. On the right is a very telling comment. As they moved to own what they had more, they were dealing with conflicting. They need to centralize into a single system, coordinate into a single system, and they had 5 different CMDBs from different vendors spread around before. That's a definite recipe. That's not federation. That's rather a recipe for success. Not a good idea. So look a little bit at what's going on today with deployments across the CMDB, CMS, and DDM. I know 3 acronyms right in a row. So last year, our data showed that 51% of our respondents had CMDBs or CMS actively working and deployed. And so I get a lot of questions about, are CMDBs going away? Clearly, the industry hype sometimes pushes them, will create that illusion. In reality, though, going back a little while, we saw 57% a few years ago had CMDBs deployed, so a slight decline, but then a few years before that, it was just 52%. So the broad story is, despite industry skepticism, CMDB and CMS deployments are pretty much sustaining the level they've been over the last at least 5 to 7 years, at least based on our data. Last year, 69% had federated data and starting to federate, and 25% were looking to federate. The federation is strongly on the rise. Before that, we had only 2 years ago, it was only 44% versus 69% that had federated data. The bottom is interesting, and it's something that we'll revisit again in terms of approach. Okay, you've got a CMDB CMS. How much time are you spending reconciling data? 12 hours was the average. We'll show a chart later on that will show a greater variety. But what was interesting is those who were most successful invested more time in reconciling data. Clearly, technology is evolving to make that more efficient and more automated, but taking data seriously in terms of content and accuracy and relevance is key. We'll look at, so this is a build of a kind. If you start in the middle here, most dominant use cases were asset and change management. And we'll look at that in a more granular way a little bit later. But in terms of most, just checking off everything you're doing, data center migration and financial optimization and security actually led the pack. And as I mentioned, CMDB CMS strongly correlated with overall success. Only 3% of our respondents last year had no plans whatsoever for discovery and dependency mapping. And several years ago, 2 years ago, that was 29% had no plans. So federation and discovery and dependency mapping are clearly on the rise. And the dominant use case, as you could see, was performance and availability. So that becomes a complementary way of building their system. So here we're looking at the hard data around use cases in terms of top 2. Not surprisingly, asset management leads with change and performance. Performance being a growing requirement as the CMS becomes a more dynamic story. Financial optimization, change impact. So change impact is looking at the impact of changes on performance. Change management is actually managing them. And change impact is more that if-then. If we do this, then what happens? Data center migration and security. So the left axis is how successful they were in their CMDB or CMS deployment. mapped against the pretty colors there, extremely successful in dark blue, very successful in green, and all others who fell into not so successful in orange. It's a pretty straightforward statement that CMDB and CMS success correlates very strongly with overall success in broad-ranging ITSM initiatives. I couldn't really ask for a more compelling color scheme there. When we looked at use cases, more specifically for discovery and dependency mapping, you can see performance at the top, data center consolidation following it, which is a natural, and then you look at, so top performance for business services, and then looking at performance and availability for the core infrastructure. So that you can see strong focus on performance and availability. Then change and vulnerabilities, move to the cloud, and asset management. It's still very relevant for asset management, but not as top a use case as CMDB CMS. And again, only 3% had no plans. So when we look at real deployments and we work with real deployments, we look for a couple of things. One is relevance to what's needed, and one is a step-by-step plan to make it work, rather than trying to put all the data in one place and hope that you're done just by having data in one place. And this is a nice narration, short narration. We started putting incident, request, problem, and change. And this took time. Bit by bit they did that. Now they're also looking to bring in application management requirements and putting in metrics to show operational efficiencies in particular, but also cost-related efficiencies so they can communicate to the business their value. Now we'll look at some of the impact on transformational initiatives. We'll start with cloud. Cloud really needs to be managed as an extended resource, and that includes public cloud. The notion that cloud is simply a destination, you get there and you can have a drink and enjoy the spa is not, of course, the way it works. You need to be able to optimize it and understand it. And so all the understanding of interdependencies, all the understanding of what's out there, and all the ability to relate it to services and service management remain even more important, although they require innovative technologies to do so, right? So from an asset management perspective, you can see that it's made it more challenging. A lot of automation is increasingly required for cloud, and we've seen already that a good CMS can provide a great context for more effective automation, including release management and specifically as well in provisioning services. But cloud is also a resource. So it has clearly a good and a challenge to it. When we looked at, in prior research, reasons for sharing CMDB insights with a cloud service provider, that doesn't generally mean that your CMDB is directly accessed by the service provider. That can happen. But it usually means that they're willing to listen to you and your data based on your CMS. That can be a political conversation, but it's clearly worthwhile. And here are some of the reasons why. Improving management, security, and compliance, help to manage change more cohesively across the whole environment, right? Because you're not just looking at the public cloud. Integrate the cloud providers more effectively with best practice. Well, that's more indirect more often than not, but great if you can do it. Optimize internal traditional infrastructure vis-a-vis cloud resources. Again, understanding the trade-offs between the two, and actually making sure the cloud providers are doing what they're supposed to in your bigger context. Looking at discovery and dependency mapping, which is becoming very actively involved in optimizing cloud. This is a two-slide conversation, so I'll be brief with each item. The first and the bottom on this chart are clearly linked. One is understanding the data center, getting visibility into the totality of what's there, with continual insight, understanding the changes continually and what's going on. So 1 and 4 here are ongoing insight into the reality of what you have. Provisioning, linked with automation, and service impact, understanding where things are and how changes are going to impact services. Compliance and risk assessment can be very key with cloud. It doesn't get simpler necessarily just because the cloud service providers are there with their technologies. It needs to be managed, and it can become especially tricky in DevOps environments where developers are reaching into odd pockets of things that they think they can get their hands on that might not be appropriate for from a security or compliance perspective. No server left behind, meaning that if you are migrating to cloud, you understand the big picture in doing so. Migrating application workloads and software license management by understanding what's not being used, where things are not being used, not necessarily leveraging the DDM to get insight into licenses per se, but knowing where things are no longer being utilized. So again, from one of our consulting conversations, CMDB was a pivotal factor, CMDB at the core of moving to cloud and enabling automation, giving a blueprint of what they wanted in cloud so they could see more effectively how to leapfrog the process. Building what they call, I love the term, a next generation infrastructure. So support for DevOps, too often I hear at times, there's sort of CMDB is, the old guard, and DevOps is the new guard, and Agile anyway is the new guard, and Scrum. And we actually spoke to a group in development that had purchased a CMDB, pushed it into operations using Scrum because operations was too siloed. So the notion that understanding where things are, how they interrelate, their configuration issues, and the application dependencies belongs in the past doesn't seem to be logically true, certainly not for DevOps or even really for Agile. And we looked at how this can happen, again, from our data from that last research last year. We saw that CMDB TMS can be used to provision pre-production environments, and along with enabling automation to help do so. And some of the other areas from an ITSM perspective, and the question with ITSM teams enabling support for DevOps, involve common workflows, scheduling, feedback loops on both usage and quality, relevance of the application, and quality of performance. Something that I think the industry still got a lot to work on in bringing those conversations together with operations and APM. We're still waiting for that to happen in a bigger way in general. By the way, the top and perhaps the most obvious value was actually workflow, but CMDB was only 6 percentage points below. So we saw, for instance, 36% using workflow, 30% using CMDB CMS to provision. So not much of a drop. And 88% of ours, those we spoke to, thought that ITSM support for DevOps was either very or extremely positive. 0% thought it was negative. So last year's work in security and operations, or bringing security together with operations, was also very telling. Here again, you have a map of those just having a CMDB or CMS deployed, or DDM in this case, and the relationship between those who saw themselves as extremely successful or very successful or otherwise. And you can see again, the colors align. I couldn't do a better job myself if I created it myself. So despite what, again, some in the industry might think CMDB CMS can be a huge bridge and supporting and enabling security and operations to work together. Another 88%, interestingly enough, those who had service modeling involved, those in this chart, 88% were sharing CI attributes between security and operations, 88%. And 73% were coordinating ITAM, IT asset management, and SAM audits, also with SecOps, and it correlated strongly with SecOps success. Another aside on that research, we were able to identify 5 teams who could coordinate the security and operations initiative. ITSM, an overlay team sort of driven at the top, security and operations virtually tied, and development. The #1 success rate was affiliated with ITSM teams. Close behind them were overlay, security and operations kind of tied for 3rd place, just as they were tied in number, and development a strong last. So in terms of optimizing IT for financial performance, you see a long list of values. You'll be able to get, I believe, the deck, so don't worry about committing them all to memory. But #1 is optimizing assets in cloud and hybrid cloud environments. Cloud once again comes in. Then integrated vision of inventory and discovery, which relates, of course, very strongly. Lifecycle asset, being able to introduce new assets. Mapping assets to applications, very key. Mapping assets to operational owners, so you can start looking at governance and efficiencies. Retirement of assets, and mapping assets to customers, so you can start to begin, if you're in a with partners and suppliers and customers, understand those dependencies as well. And then cross-domain collaboration across all of IT, an evolving story for sure, so that assets are not managed in a purely siloed manner. Only 19%, by the way, were not supporting asset management in support of financial optimization in their CMDB. And you can see once again, perfect coloring here. You're going to be successful. Indeed, you'll be more successful in optimizing IT for financial performance if you have a CMDB or CMS deployed. So now we'll jump into some of our lessons learned from consulting and otherwise in terms of how to make all this work better. So there's a long list and long sources for what can be challenging. And the list here is at least a good start. This came from consulting sources. Resources always can be an issue. It does require a political resource, an executive resource, and also requires a dedicated team and people willing to work with that dedicated team, which means people and money. But often it's the people side that can become the trickier. Data integration, reconciliation, absolute requirement. You invest in technologies that are increasingly getting better at doing this dynamically, but it's something that requires continued attention. Concerns about security and data access. What are you exposing and revealing and creating with CMDB and CMS, just as CMDB and CMS has shown its value in enabling more effective SecOps in parallel. Keeping current, something that current technologies are increasingly getting better at. The politics concerning ownership of everything, and especially data, often with a somewhat psychological flair to it. Auto discovery and core population. If you if you don't have good discovery and you don't have good inventory, you're not ready to do the CMDB CMS yet. You need to have that platform first. Getting automation done in the way that works. And please set your use case priorities so that you know that you're not trying to do everything at once. Build on what's most relevant to you. A couple of quotes from people we talked with. By the way, when we do consulting, we do usually 20 interviews at minimum across stakeholders. We had one CIO who said, oh, you don't need to do that. I sent an email out yesterday, so that's all set. We refused the gig if he didn't allow it. And after we came back with the data from the interviews, he wanted us to do 20 more. So what are some of the surprising or not so surprising comments? Data ownership is a big deal, someone said. People are very territorial. It's a cultural change. We're responsible for our own data. If we give up control, we're afraid we won't manage it properly. Loss of control of data is loss of power. On communication, often this top-down magic doesn't work so well. The big picture is very well communicated. The details are lost the further down you get. And one comment that we love, use it in the book, the hamster scenario, running on habit. Hamster running around its wheel, you've got processes in place, and you're used to those processes. When you step back, how do you change those processes? How do you make the difference? In other words, when does that hamster get off its wheel and think it might move in new directions? That's also key for effective CMS. We talked about the 12-hour average. You can see in terms of paying attention to data reconciliation, on data accuracy, you can see some moving up into 25 or more hours per week. And again, ideally, you have an automated solution that allows you to do this very effectively and efficiently, but still wants your attention. We talked about how the move to federation is on the rise, and you can see that federation also, the colors speak for themselves, correlates strongly with more effective outcomes. And here again, in IT service management, broader level initiatives. And so this is one chart that could be a whole webinar in itself and has been. I'll just do it quickly for you, though. This is our methodology. Number one, what are your objectives? Understand those. What are your top relevant objectives before you go forward with the CMS? Then what do you have that can support it? You want to make sure you've got some level of discovery. You want to do a technology audit. Number three, you want to kind of understand where you are on the evolutionary curve. We have our own model, as do most consultancies. And you want to adjust for that, do it fairly, because that also affects where you want to invest and what you want to do. By then, you're ready to define your architectural requirements and make technology selections. Once you've done that and you're ready to deploy, you're ready to look at very specific gating factors in deployment. Develop your roadmap based on relevance and priorities for use case, and review milestones as they evolve. That's the very quick summary of what could be a long discussion. It's in the book, of course. I'll make a comment that a lot of this involves self-discovery, and we work with people to help do that. This is a comment about federation, actually, and how one of the challenges of federations usually involves multi-vendor environments, and so it's not always something that is easily imagined by the vendor themselves. And this is no reflection on Micro Focus, which has one of the best broader portfolios and can support it very well. But in this case, not referring to Micro Focus, I think that we began to discover federation through trial and error. Most of the capabilities are there in technology, but our vendor never told us the why. So we're getting there on our own, kind of. Again, that was not Micro Focus, but it's a story. The federation is really, to some degree, a vendor-neutral story, making things work where they need to work. And wrapping up with a use case from Micro Focus, as they evolve, you can see the rich capabilities, varied in support of software assets, server and network management, compliance and security needs, support for development, and virtually all operational processes such as incident change and problem management. and also an eye to moving toward Internet of Things over time. That seems to be an area that's of growing importance, but it's still more on the horizon than right in the foreground in most environments. Last comment before I turn it over to Bill, on scalability from the same environment, and speaks well for what Micro Focus can do. Currently they have 60 to 70,000 servers, and want to keep up with all of it for asset management needs and well as infrastructure. That's about 20 million CIs currently. They know that they can move to over 100 million based on scalability. So scalability, obviously, in very large and complex environments can be key. And with this strong statement about what Micro Focus can do, I'd like to turn it over to Bill Dyke to take on from here.
All right, can you guys hear me? Someone let me know.
Yes, I can hear you,
very
Bill.
Good. All right.
Go ahead.
Thank you. All right. My name is Bill Dyke. I am a product manager at Micro Focus, representing the configuration management system solution. We call it the CMS. This capability, this tool set includes both of a CMDB, which we call Universal CMDB, as well as the discovery technology we call Universal Discovery. And so it hits on many of the aspects that Dennis has just reviewed with you. I'm going to give a little bit of a conversation about how we see this fitting in and how that fits into the environment that Dennis described. One of the big things that Dennis talked about many times is that you need the data in your system, you need the data to be accurate, and you need a pretty complete view of the data that's available there. So we've been recognizing this and call it more of a hybrid type environment, and that our data center environments are heterogeneous. They're not the same, and with even customers running content with the same application across their enterprise, it'll be different from one customer to the next. And so the ability to be able to have a tool that can be flexible enough to be able to capture information regardless of how you have deployed that environment, that's critical, because that gives you the ability to have a full set of data completely representing your environment. And so we see that the hybrid IT environment needs this kind of idea, this kind of concept. You need to be able to capture content in real time so that you can see what's going on in your environment right away, not the way it was several days ago. You need a discovery capability that can be comprehensive and very and meet kind of any environment that you actually have, and any security model that you have. One of the benefits that we see that our tool has is the ability to be able to talk to systems through many security models that our competitors don't support. For instance, we can deploy an agent to a box when your security model indicates you can't have a remote account placed on systems because it puts too much risk of your environment for hacking or intrusions. You need something to be able to model what your services are, because from an IT perspective, we can get kind of focused on the fact that we have an infrastructure out there, and it's important to know what that infrastructure looks like and what servers are there and what software is installed and running on those servers. But when you think about it from a customer perspective, they don't care about that at all. They care about the service that they provide, which will be a collection of systems, not just one system. And so you need to understand how that service is actually architected so that when something changes on that service, you can understand the impact, or you can troubleshoot to the actual problem rather than try to figure out how things are all connected. So being able to model services and to do that in an automated way is a capability that is very important. You need a single UI to be able to represent all the data, to be able to collect information through a discovered type environment, the DDM context that Dennis talked about. But there's also other points of data that don't involve discovery, and that's like integrations. And so if you have workstation data inside of Microsoft's SCCM tool, and you have other custom tools inside of your environment that collect data, you need to be able to bring that data into a single point of context so that you have a single view of that data. You don't want to be able to try to figure out the potential impact of a change when you have content for that change spread across multiple systems. you're going to miss something, and then when you make a change, you're going to bring some service down. And then lastly, you need to be able to proactively capture information. So based on a schedule or real time, be able to go out and understand what's in your environment and what's changing that. Be able to capture all of the IP addresses that are causing traffic to be deployed, as well as being able to capture the devices that are causing that traffic. And then to be able to use that data to better represent the scope of your discovery so that you're capturing the full picture and not just a portion of it. So this is what our tools, the Universal Discovery and CMDB, actually provide through Micro Focus. We have a single UI. We have a reconciliation engine that is second to none, that can bring data in through any source and to keep track of that data to make sure that if there are two servers out there that you're capturing from different places and it's actually representing the same piece of information, CMDB will be able to understand that and consolidate that into one record. It will also be able to understand when two records actually do need to remain distinct from each other, and you'll have that data accurate in your environment. We have comprehensive discovery that allows you to be able to discover from L2 to L7. You can do discovery agent-based or agentless-based, and you can do it both ways. If you have some environments in your enterprise that do not allow for remote access, you can deploy an agent there. And if you have other environments that you prefer to be able to do remote access, you can do that as well. And the data that you collect is the same. It's just that you have flexibility in the manner that you actually collect that data. CMDB has the ability to be able to service model. You can do that manually. You can do that in an automated fashion. And we have a full set of integration capabilities through all of Micro Focus's tools, as well as with many of our partners and competitors as well. One question I get asked a lot is that I'm moving to the cloud. Does that mean I don't need a CMS anymore, don't need a configuration management database anymore? The way we look at it is the cloud gives you a collection of benefits that you can't get from an on-premise infrastructure. It gives you a lot of flexibility. It gives you a lot of the ability to be able to use on demand. What it doesn't give you, though, is the ability to track how the cloud presents its services to your customers and how components you may have in other spaces of your enterprise, in virtualized environments and on-premise systems and cloud systems. All of these systems can be used to be able to provide a single service to a customer. And if you don't have that big picture of what that environment looks like, which includes the cloud components, you're still missing out. You're still going to have problems with making changes in your environment. You're going to have unplanned downtime. It's going to be difficult for your support people to figure out what's actually going on because they won't have a complete picture of the environment. And so we find that even with the cloud transformation coming, and as we shift workload to our cloud in a production way, the same use cases that we supported previously exist in the cloud space as well. Transformation, being able to move your workload from your physical or virtual environments to the cloud. The ability to be able to do software asset management to determine what applications you're running from an audit perspective. You need to know that, and where you place those applications really has no relevance. You still need to track that. Being able to see the service that you're providing in its entirety with the cloud components that are available, as well as how they interact with the on-prem or virtualized type environments that you have and maintain. So we see that moving to the cloud really doesn't have any impact on your need for a CMDB. You still need to be able to have that, and you need to be able to collect that data from a cloud environment regardless of where it's actually stored. And so to that end, CMS has been working to have the ability to capture information from the primary cloud vendors, AWS and Azure, and most recently Google Cloud. And we also can capture information from private cloud technologies such as VMware's vCloud, OpenStack, Cloud Foundry, and Pivotal Cloud Foundry, and lately the whole Docker container and the ability for Kubernetes to manage the Docker infrastructure. And so we capture all that, and we can represent that in a model that is seamlessly integrated with any other models and collections of data that you might have that talk to each other. We can capture much of this in real time. We can capture it through the APIs that are provided by the cloud vendors or the private cloud application components. and we can represent that inside of CMS very simply. So that's the end of what I have. It is possible to actually download and try CMDB and UD yourself. The URL there is on the screen. It will allow you to be able to get a free license that is unrestricted for a short period of time to be able to get your hands dirty with the tool and get some experience with it, and then you can also contact me independently as well. There is a white paper that Dennis has created that is actually the source for this whole presentation and webinar. And so the link to be able to access that white paper is also placed here as well. Raleigh, let's hand it back to you. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I will provide these links in the follow-up email. So again, I hope that you will check that out. If you have any questions, you can log them now using the Q&A functionality. Bill, let's start with you. How quickly could I see benefits from a newly implemented CMDB solution?
So it really depends on how you approach this. I've worked with customers that have tried to do everything all at once. I heard Dennis talk about the fact that you really want to take this in a manner that is structured. There are various levels of maturity that you go through as you learn how to do this. In other words, you don't want to get into a service mapping exercise before you have all of the infrastructure ready to be able to map those services. And then even more important, you want to make sure that you know what your goals are. I came from IT, as I mentioned. I was part of HP's IT organization for many years. And while we didn't do everything great, one thing we did actually really well is that we had a process team, a configuration management process team that gave to us the objectives that we wanted to achieve with the tools. And so CMDB was flexible enough to be able to meet those objectives, but the fact that we had them helped us understand how to approach this. And so rather than when we were pushing data from one system to the next, we knew what data to push rather than get the answer to the question being, when I ask what data you want, they'll go, we have no idea, send us all. Send us all of it. That's not a good thing. You want to have an understanding. So being able to have the processes and understand why you're doing what you're doing, and then start from the beginning the actual discovery process to be able to see what you have and how to match those two together. That's the fastest way to be able to start getting value of this. So it's hard to give an actual timeline other than those would be the first two places that I would start.
Good to know. Thank you, Bill. And how tightly coupled could a CMDB be with a cloud service provider?
So in the case of the Micro Focus CMS, we actually talk directly to the APIs of AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud. So with one discovery job, you can capture the full topology, which is basically all of the components of the cloud provider and the infrastructure as a service, the platform as a service components, all of that, and their relationships to each other in one call. And so it's rather simple, and it's pretty all-inclusive. You can dive in deeper, but it can be, in the case of universal discovery, we get a very good representation of the environment with just one particular call for an account on one of those cloud providers.
Great, thank you. Dennis, let's jump over to you. If CMDB CMS adoption is still significant, why aren't we hearing more about it?
That's a good question. And I would love to say that I control the media, but I do not. I would say that what has happened has been a rather fractured approach to looking at technologies to unify IT, which is a lot of what I focus on, and CMS, CMDB is one of them. Analytics for IT, AIOps and related family is another example. A lot, the AIOps area has become very attractive to the media. CMDB seems to be forgotten, and I think there are a couple of reasons for that, though, historically. One is that a lot of what a CMDB was got defined in market definitions that were very constricting to what it needed to be, and so it rather inhibited evolution of the capability. The other is that frankly, early on when there was the most hype around CMDB and CMS, the technologies were still early on, not nearly as dynamic, not nearly as able to cope with changes as much as they should. And so there was a great vision, but there was a gap in the technology. And those are maybe the two most critical factors aside from media behavior, which is always the headline of the day. Maybe we'll get a new one for the CMDB CMS coming up. Maybe that's about to happen.
Thanks, Dennis. Can you also explain more about what you mean by federation?
Sure. And that could be a good long conversation. But in general, what federation means is not simply putting the same data everywhere. That's not what it means. It means having defined sources for data that are can go more into depth based on need. An asset management database, it might be more detailed asset information. Performance-related databases that have more detail on performance and their dependencies right on down the line. And then being able to have a modeling system that can unify insights across all those environments with the CMDB at the center. Years ago, EMA talked about a real-time CMDB and a sort of traditional CMDB that was, as the system was evolving. Now CMDBs are becoming much more real-time, and some are fully real-time. But again, you need to have layers of access so you can go between context and real-time reality when you're dealing with microservices, when you're dealing with containers, when you're dealing with transactional vagaries. All those things need to be federated. So that's the short answer anyway.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask you both one final wrap-up question, starting with you, Dennis. Do you have any insights on how organizationally a CMDB CMS initiative should be managed?
Sure, we do. I do, thanks to our consulting practice primarily, actually. Well, no, from our research as well. And I would say, by the way, this applies to most initiatives that require cross-domain or cross-silo collaboration with IT. You do need the executive suite on board and supportive. They don't necessarily have to be too directly involved, but there needs the involvement at that level should be in support of the initiative, in support of communication around the initiative, and in support of the demands that the initiative may require for people to share data and participate. It shouldn't be up to a mid-level team to fight every little organization to make that happen. So beyond that, though, there should be in parallel, more of a mid-level team to do the actual work, to make it work, and work with various stakeholders who are defined, ideally, throughout IT to optimize benefits to them. It's a double-edged sword. A little extra work to make sure the data is there and current and right, but also you get the benefits of use cases directly relevant to you. So that's the double-edged sword conversation there. And again, a very short answer to what could be a longer conversation.
Thank you, Dennis. I actually have two final questions for Bill. The first is, how do you make sure the CMDB asset DB is accurate all the time in the virtual IT area like VMs, Docker, et cetera?
Yeah, there are two ways to be able to actually discover content. You can discover content based on a schedule, so you go out and look at environments like once a day or such, and that's been relatively stable for a while now, and is prevalent for systems that are stable themselves, that don't change that often. But in a highly dynamic environment such as virtualization and Docker, you want to be able to see what's going on in real time, because if you do it just once a day, you may miss a change that happened in the middle of that. So CMS has the ability to be able to log into the management queues and monitor them to be able to see what's going on. So if a VM is created or moves from host to host, we can capture that and do that in real time. So it's not a scheduled environment anymore. At that point, you're actually looking at the content dynamically to see what's going on and what's changing in real time.
Thank you, Bill. Let's take one final question, and it is, what are the keys to keeping data accuracy issues at a minimum? What are your recommendations?
From our perspective, I heard Dennis talk about spending time with the reconciliation methods, and so understanding the data that you're collecting and knowing how in your particular environment you distinguish one system from another. The UCMDB is a very open environment, and you can tweak the existing rules that help UCMDB understand how to manage those differences. And we actually did that in IT as well. So understanding how you differentiate one system from the next, and then tweaking the rules that UCMDB knows to take that into account, that's the first thing. And then making sure that you're actually doing discovery and not managing the data manually. Anything that's managed manually will be incorrect within minutes of you actually doing it. So pulling that data in from a discovered environment, running the jobs that make it so that you understand what IPs are actually creating traffic, and then ensuring that you're talking to those IPs in your environment is important.
Thank you for that advice, Bill. And I wanted to thank our audience for taking time out of your schedule to join us for today's event. Again, you will be receiving an email from EMA later today with additional resources from today's event, and I hope that you'll join us for a future event. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day.